can be a very difficult component of public speaking, even when the projector is wanting to work. A few decades ago, a young man, a newly elected representative of his constituents, sat in the House chamber waiting for his first speech. The time came, he stood up, stepped forward, and he couldn't remember. Over the next 3 minutes, he managed to throw out a few words, mostly silence, and then he sat down again. He covered his face with his hands, and he vowed that this would never happen again. So when we think about public speaking, we so often think that it's something that comes to some people naturally. Extroverts, they have it easy, they like to talk all the time anyway, so who cares if it's to 50 people or 100 people? But not necessarily. It's the people who work at it who will become the best speakers. That young man who failed his way through that speech, kept working. He overcame his lisp by rehearsing over and over such phrases as, "The Spanish ships I cannot see, for they are not in sight." He hired a speech specialist to work on his speech impediments, and who wrote to him in 1901 that practice and perseverance are alone necessary. With a bulldog perseverance, Winston Churchill not only overcame his fear of public speaking, but he is now regarded as one of the top orators of the 20th century, and his speech to the nation on June 18, 1940 is now considered one of the most famous English speeches of all time. Tonight we will use Winston Churchill's finest hour speech as a case study for the type of speaking that is on the surface the easiest, but perhaps the hardest to do well: manuscript speaking. When I first walked into my last public speaking class at university, I was overjoyed to hear that we would be challenged in that class. We were going to be doing 4 speeches with no notes whatsoever. We did demonstrations. We did inspirational speeches. We told stories. We introduced ourselves in the character of somebody else without notes. Then came our 5th and final speech. The teacher said, "All right, it's a manuscript speech. You will be speaking word for word from something you have written beforehand." And we all go, "Say what?" Because you see, we had gotten so used to the style that we use here at Toastmasters. Few or no notes. You have to go with the immediacy of the moment. What's that sense of verisimilitude? I am right here, I am present, I am speaking now, and coming up with the exact phrases at this moment. And it gives that energy and that personalization to a speech. And now we have to do that ahead of time. You see, on the surface, a manuscript speech is the easiest of all. It's what the beginnerest of beginners could do. You get up and you read a speech. So when do we use manuscript speeches? Well, regular people use manuscript speeches for formal occasions of all types. From after-dinner speeches to inaugural speeches, well, maybe not normal people doing inaugural speeches, but wedding toasts, retirement roasts, that's when we use very carefully worded and personalized speeches. At the other end of the manuscript spectrum, you have important calls to action from a political or social perspective, where exact word choice for the most impact is a must. So let's talk about the context of Winston Churchill's finest hour speech. These were the days of preparation before Great Britain joined World War II. These are the days that historian John Ramsden describes on an NPR broadcast as the big buildings in central London, the museums and galleries, the palace even. We were all surrounded by sandbags. And then there were these great barrage balloons hanging over the city and the searchlights playing across the clouds at night. And there were sirens ready. They were not used much yet, but the practices were going on. Churchill had been Prime Minister of Great Britain for just 5 weeks, according to Sam Jones's 2010 article in The Guardian. Poland, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and finally France were already fallen to Hitler's Third Reich. In his speech, Churchill said, "What General Reagan calls the Battle of France is over. I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin." Now the greatest speech, or the greatest strength of a manuscript speech, is the writing. manuscript speeches give so much control to the speaker ahead of time if the speaker is willing to take that control. Unlike in extemporaneous speaking, the type of speaking that we do here at Toastmasters and is perhaps most commonly used in public speaking, the individual words, the turn of phrase, matters so much more. These are speeches that get quoted, that get filmed, that get remembered, that are written for the emotion that they will convey, as well as for the spot-on particular details that have to be accurate, especially when your political opponents are also watching. Preparing a manuscript speech is thus incredibly difficult, even though it can appear so easy on the surface. You have to put yourself in that setting, in the zone, in the emotions that you would just want to convey, but you have to plan them ahead of time. Churchill wrote in 1897 as a young man that before the orator can arouse with emotion, can inspire with an emotion, he must be swayed by it himself. When he aroused the people's indignation, his heart is filled with anger. Before he can move their tears, his own must flow. To convince them, he must himself believe. So the same tools that we use for effective writing can be used in this context for effective speaking. And that is one of the great gifts of a manuscript speech, is that time ahead of time of the actual presentation of the speech. You have visual word choice, metaphor, syntax, alliteration, repetition, the roasting, the toasting. You have the metaphors that can be built to inspire those emotions and those feelings that you want your listeners to walk away with. But the real difficulty of manuscript speaking is in the delivery. It can be really, really boring. So we've all been to probably at least one of the speeches that I'm about to describe. I don't know if you can even call it a speech. I call it college. College presentations. You know, student stands up here and they read off their PowerPoint and they tell you all sorts of cool stuff that's listed up there on the PowerPoint for you to read. They've got cool statistics, they've got maybe a picture thrown in there. But all in all, we've got attention focused on a lovely square of light and nothing on the speaker. The speaker isn't bringing anything to the presentation besides an essay that everyone could have read faster on their own. So with a manuscript speech, it seems so easy to just get up there and you read something. But you have to bring life to these words that you've breathed life into before. Poorly done manuscript speeches, they forget about the speaker. Why have the speaker there if everybody could just be emailed this thing, we didn't all have to show up at the same time? The speaker has to bring that life and that presence. The greatest performances rely on great writing. The most famous theater scenes are the results of a perfect marriage between incredible words and careful delivery. And a speech should be the same. The speaker has to maintain energetic dynamism and intimate eye contact so as not to lose the audience. Really, the challenge is reading while appearing not to read. So how did Churchill overcome this difficulty? A few different ways. He spoke through his ideas before he wrote them. Before he would write his speech, he would spend the previous couple of weeks just sort of chatting about it to people, talking through some sentences, getting a feel for what he wanted to say before he actually sat down and had his secretary type it out. He edited until the end. Even the final copies of Their Finest Hour speech has his handwriting all over it as he was marking it up. And finally, he treated all of his speeches like poetry. Every speech is a rhymeless, meterless verse. He chopped up the final lines of Their Finest Hour speech into poetry form, and thus created one of the most recognizable manuscript speeches of all time, which ends as so. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad and sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth shall last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. Mr. Toastmaster.